In the quiet hill country of central Italy, where olive trees grow among sunburnt stones and peasants till the same land their ancestors worked for generations, a boy named Titus Flavius Vespasianus was born into modest circumstances. His family were not aristocrats, not senators, not even members of the equestrian order when he came into the world in the year 09 AD. They were simple country folk, hard-working and unremarkable in the eyes of the Roman elite. Yet, from those unassuming roots, Vespasian would rise to become emperor of the most powerful empire on earth. His story was not one of divine prophecy or noble lineage. It was a story of grit, discipline, and survival in a system that chewed up men who dared to rise too fast. His father, Flavius Sabinus, was a customs official in the provinces. A job with little glory, but enough stability to provide for his family. His mother, Vespasia Paula, came from a minor noble family in Nursia, and it was through her that Vespasian's fortunes began to shift upward. She had ambition for her sons and made sure they pursued military and administrative service. Her brother, a senator, helped pull some strings, and Vespasian found his way into public life, though not without setbacks. As a young man, he lacked the flair of a Caesar or the ruthlessness of a Tiberius. In fact, he was often mocked by his peers for being stiff, dull, and too plain-spoken to survive in Rome's cutthroat political theater. Despite the ridicule, Vespasian persevered. He joined the military and served in Thrace, where he earned a reputation not for brilliance, but for discipline. He was the kind of officer who led from the front, who drilled his men relentlessly, who never asked of them what he wouldn't do himself. The legions respected that. They didn't need philosophers or poets. They needed leaders who could keep them alive, keep them fed, and win battles. Vespasian was that kind of leader. When the Roman campaigns in Britain began under Emperor Claudius, Vespasian was given command of the 2nd Legion. It was there that his name began to carry weight. The conquest of Britain was brutal, slow, and unforgiving. The tribes there did not break easily. The terrain was hostile, the weather even more so, and the logistics were a nightmare. Vespasian fought not just warriors, but hunger, disease, and mutiny. At over time, he secured 30 towns, fought 30 battles, and brought the Isle of Wight under Roman control. Claudius recognized his effectiveness and promoted him, but even then, Vespasian remained grounded. He was never flashy, never indulgent, kept his money, avoided political feuds, and focused on results. These were not the typical traits of a rising star in Rome, but they would eventually save him. By the time Nero came to power, Vespasian was already a seasoned general and had served as a consul. However, his career stalled when he fell out of favor with the emperor. Some say it was because Vespasian fell asleep during one of Nero's endless performances, a crime Nero could not forgive. Others claim it was simply because Vespasian was not the kind of man who flattered or groveled. Either way, he was dismissed from court and faded into obscurity. It seemed his career had ended. But Vespasian had learned one crucial thing: Rome was not a place of steady paths. It was a place of sudden reversals, where yesterday's exile could be tomorrow's emperor. When the Jewish revolt broke out in 66 AD, Nero reluctantly turned to Vespasian, one of the few generals with the experience and temperament to handle such a crisis. The East was volatile, a place where zealots and governors clashed with terrifying frequency. The province of Judea was in open rebellion, and it threatened to inspire revolts elsewhere. Vespasian, now older and more grizzled, took up the command with his son Titus as his deputy. Together, they began the methodical campaign to crush the revolt. It was a slow, brutal war of sieges and attrition. Cities burned, thousands died. But slowly, inch by inch, the Romans advanced. It was during this campaign, far from Rome, that Vespasian's fate would shift once again. In 68 AD, Nero committed suicide, leaving a power vacuum that plunged Rome into civil war. 3 emperors rose and fell within a year: Galba, Otho, and Vitellius. Each claimed legitimacy. Each tried to secure the loyalty of the legions. But it was Vespasian, still in Judea, who quietly gathered support. His soldiers loved him. The eastern provinces backed him. Egypt, the grain basket of the empire, pledged loyalty. The pieces were falling into place, and Vespasian did not hesitate. By late 69 AD, the year of the 4 emperors was reaching its bloody climax. Vespasian's forces moved westward. In Italy, his supporters battled the forces of Vitellius, who had taken Rome and declared himself emperor. The fighting was brutal, with urban battles erupting in the streets of the capital. But eventually Vitellius was captured and executed, and Vespasian was declared emperor by the Senate. He did not enter the city triumphantly on a chariot or wrapped in purple. Instead, he took power with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his life preparing for it. Vespasian inherited a broken empire. The treasury was empty. The provinces were restive. The legions were politicized and unreliable. Worse still, the moral fabric of Rome had been shredded by years of excess, corruption, and cruelty under Nero and his successors. Vespasian knew that rebuilding the empire would take more than soldiers and taxes. It would take credibility. So he began the slow process of restoring Rome's foundations. He reinstated discipline in the army. He cut wasteful spending, taxed the rich, even famously levying a tax on public urinals, earning him both ridicule and praise. But Vespasian was unbothered by mockery. He understood power in a way that few of his predecessors had. He knew that image mattered, but not more than substance. He allowed satire. He laughed at himself. He was not divine, not descended from gods. He was a farmer's son who had clawed his way to the top, and he made no effort to hide it. That humility, rare in Rome's marble halls, became his greatest strength. The people respected him. The Senate, once terrified of emperors, found him tolerable. The provinces, weary of chaos, welcomed his firm hand. He began construction projects, not to glorify himself, but to stabilize the empire. The most famous of these was the Flavian Amphitheater, later known as the Colosseum. Built on the ruins of Nero's Golden House, it was a symbolic gesture. Where Nero had hoarded pleasure, Vespasian gave the people games. Where Nero had built palaces, Vespasian built monuments for the public. It was not just architecture, it was policy. It was message. Rome, under Vespasian, was not the playground of emperors. It was the heart of a civilization restored to discipline and order. As he aged, Vespasian began to prepare the next generation. He groomed his son Titus to succeed him, breaking with the chaotic tradition of the last emperors. The idea of dynastic succession was not new, but Vespasian was determined to make it stable. He involved Titus in governance, military command, and diplomacy. By the time Vespasian fell ill in 79 AD, Rome was ready. On his deathbed, he joked that he was becoming a god, mocking the tradition of deifying emperors. Even in death, he remained grounded. He died not as a tyrant nor a hero, but as a man who had saved Rome from itself. When Vespasian assumed control of the Roman Empire in 69 AD, he stepped into a world trembling from instability. The chaos of civil war had torn through the political and social fabric of the empire. People no longer trusted their leaders. The legions had become kingmakers instead of soldiers, and the Senate had been reduced to a ceremonial echo chamber. The empire needed more than just a ruler. It needed reconstruction, not of buildings or roads alone, but of principles, of purpose, and of trust. Vespasian understood this better than anyone. Unlike emperors who came before him, he had no interest in theatrical displays of power. What mattered was order. His approach was methodical and often unglamorous. He tightened Rome's purse strings, raised taxes, and rooted out corruption in the administrative ranks. He restructured the tax system to stop money from vanishing into the pockets of governors and equestrians. He didn't pretend that Rome's problems would go away with parades or speeches. Instead, he treated the empire like a wounded machine that needed each part repaired, no matter how small. The treasury, left nearly empty by Nero's extravagance, began to recover under Vespasian's strict fiscal policies. He even taxed latrines, famously justifying it with the phrase, "Money does not stink." Despite his seriousness, Vespasian didn't rule with cruelty. He could be harsh when necessary, but he preferred ridicule to wrath. He allowed satire and tolerated criticism, a sharp contrast to Nero's persecution of dissenters. This tolerance earned him grudging respect from philosophers, poets, and ordinary citizens. In a city that had grown accustomed to fear, Vespasian's humor, dry and often self-deprecating, was like fresh air. It didn't make him beloved in the way Augustus had been, but it made him trusted. And trust, in an empire that had teetered on the edge of collapse, was priceless. One of the boldest elements of Vespasian's rule was his use of public works as both practical investment and political message. The Colosseum, begun under his reign, was more than an amphitheater. It was a monument to stability. Built on the site of Nero's extravagant palace, it symbolized the end of imperial excess and the return of Rome to the people. Thousands of laborers, including Jewish prisoners from the revolt in Judea, were employed in its construction. Stone by stone, the structure became both a marvel of engineering and a signal that the empire had turned a page. Vespasian also focused on the provinces. He didn't see Rome as the only center of power and identity. He promoted capable men from Gaul, Spain, and Africa, bringing them into the Senate and other key roles. This broke with old traditions that prioritized Roman-born nobility, but Vespasian wasn't interested in tradition for its own sake. He wanted an empire that worked, that functioned across its vast terrain. The empire's future, he understood, lay in integrating its provinces, not in clinging to outdated hierarchies. His inclusivity was pragmatic rather than idealistic, but it laid groundwork for a broader and more resilient Roman identity. While Vespasian managed Rome, his son Titus continued the campaign in Judea. In 70 AD, Jerusalem fell. The temple was destroyed, the city burned. Though Vespasian wasn't present, the victory became one of the defining moments of his reign. It crushed one of the most persistent rebellions the empire had ever faced, sent a message to other restive provinces, and brought massive spoils back to Rome. The Arch of Titus, erected later to commemorate the victory, would forever immortalize the campaign, though the scars it left on the Jewish people would last for generations. Vespasian saw the war as a necessity, but history would remember it as a tragedy of conquest. Back in Rome, Vespasian began rebuilding the administrative organs of the state. He appointed honest men often from humble origins like his own two key posts. He knew how power corrupted, and he preferred loyalty and competence over pedigree. His staff became known for their efficiency, even if they lacked elegance. Rome's bureaucracy, once bloated and paralyzed, began to function again. Vespasian treated administration like a soldier would treat a camp, clean, organized, and disciplined. He did not want glory, he wanted results. He also focused on education and public morality. He re-endowed schools and universities, restored libraries, and supported philosophers and those who criticized him. He saw value in learning not as a personal virtue, but as a civil necessity. Rome needed thinkers just as much as it needed builders. At the same time, he discouraged luxury and extravagance, pushing back against the cultural decay of Nero's era. He reintroduced old-fashioned virtues: thrift, loyalty, discipline. These weren't just slogans, they were expectations. Perhaps the greatest testament to his wisdom was his attitude toward succession. Knowing the dangers of instability, he made it clear that his son Titus would follow him. It was an unusual move in an age when emperors came and went by force. But Vespasian believed that stability required continuity. He spent years preparing Titus, not just through flattery or titles, but by involving him in the hard work of empire. Titus was made co-ruler in practice before it was official, and the empire gradually adjusted to the idea of another Flavian on the throne. There were, of course, those who opposed this plan. Some senators disliked the idea of dynastic rule. Others feared Titus would be another Nero. But Vespasian didn't flinch. He knew Rome couldn't survive another civil war. He gambled on his son's ability to lead and on the people's weariness of chaos. The gamble would pay off at least for a time, but Vespasian would not live to see the full effects. In 79 AD, he fell ill. His final moments were marked by the same dry wit that had characterized his life. As he felt death coming, he reportedly said, "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god." With those words, the man who had dragged Rome from the brink of collapse, who had risen from humble roots to the highest office in the world, passed into history. But his legacy was not in the statues or coins. It was in the order he restored, the chaos he calmed, and the precedent he set for rulers who would follow. Vespasian had not dazzled Rome with charm or spectacle. He had done something far rarer. He had saved it from itself. In the years following Vespasian's death, the shadow he left behind was long and steady. Rome was no stranger to emperors, but it was rare for one to leave the world in peace and with an intact empire. Titus, his son and chosen successor, ascended the throne without bloodshed, rebellion, or betrayal, an almost unheard of outcome in the Roman world. This smooth transition was the fruit of Vespasian's foresight. He had spent nearly a decade preparing Titus for rule, not through ceremony, but by giving him real power and responsibility. It was less a handoff and more a shared load. Rome barely staggered as the crown passed. Titus had already earned a reputation, particularly for his role in the brutal siege of Jerusalem, but his rule proved surprisingly gentle. In a short reign of just over 2 years, he dealt with disasters that would have tested any ruler. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, a massive fire in Rome, and a plague that swept through the population. Through it all, he responded with speed and empathy, emptying the imperial treasury to help victims. Visiting the wounded and refusing to raise taxes despite the empire's needs, his popularity soared, and many came to see him as a worthy heir not only to his father's power, but to his restraint. Still, Titus' reign ended abruptly, and with it came new uncertainties. His younger brother Domitian stepped into power, another piece of Vespasian's plan, but one with a sharper edge. Domitian was cut from a different cloth. Where Vespasian had been cautious and dryly humorous, Domitian was proud, intense, and deeply suspicious. Though he continued many of his father's reforms, he ruled with a heavier hand. He demanded to be called Dominus et, Master and God, and reintroduced the fear and repression that Vespasian had done so much to soften. In many ways, the contrast between father and son would define how future generations judged the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian's style had been functional, almost anti-royal. He rejected luxury, scorned ceremony, and preferred to be seen as a working man rather than a demigod. Domitian, on the other hand, loved splendor. He rebuilt palaces, minted coins with his face in divine poses, and held elaborate games to celebrate his rule. It wasn't all theater. He improved infrastructure, stabilized currency, and boosted military morale, but the way he presented himself veered back toward the excess that had plagued Nero's reign. For many, it felt like a betrayal of the simplicity and humility Vespasian had worked so hard to normalize. But even in Domitian's reign, echoes of Vespasian's philosophy remained. The tax system stayed efficient. The provinces continued to be managed with a pragmatic eye. The bureaucracy functioned. These weren't the legacies of a tyrant, but of a builder. Domitian's rule may have tightened the grip of imperial authority, but the machine itself had been constructed by his father, and it still ran according to Vespasian's design. That resilience was part of the genius of Vespasian's leadership. He had built something that could endure, even under someone with vastly different instincts. It's easy to look back and see emperors as singular giants shaping history on their own, but Vespasian's rule showed that leadership wasn't just about the man at the top. It was about systems, teams, and structure. He didn't try to do everything himself. He delegated, trusted, and corrected. He treated the empire like a soldier treats a unit. Every piece must function, or the whole collapses. That approach created a Rome that could survive not just his life, but the lives of the men who followed. Even Domitian, for all his vanity, could not unravel the foundation laid by his father. In the years after Domitian's assassination in 96 AD, the Roman Senate would try to erase his memory, literally. Statues were smashed, names were scratched from public monuments, and histories were rewritten. But the Flavian name endured, not because of Domitian, but because of Vespasian. When people thought of the Flavians, they remembered the man who brought Rome back from the brink, who built the Colosseum, who taxed urine with a straight face, and who died with a joke on his lips. His was a legacy of function over fame, of results over rhetoric. Outside Rome, the provinces thrived under the continued order of Flavian policy. Trade routes expanded, local elites were brought into governance, and cities flourished with new construction. The image of Rome as a center of civilization, not just power, was restored. Where once governors exploited their provinces, under Vespasian's system, many began investing in them. Aqueducts, forums, theaters. These were no longer just urban projects for Rome alone. They spread like vines across the empire, a reflection of Vespasian's belief that strength came from inclusion, not domination. Even in the empire's culture, the spirit of Vespasian lingered. Writers felt freer to satirize the emperor. Poets could speak with wit instead of fear. The arts weren't just propaganda, they were entertainment and commentary again. Though Domitian later reversed some of these freedoms, the precedent had been set. The emperor did not need to be feared to be obeyed. Respect could be earned, not just commanded. It was a quiet but radical idea in Roman politics, and it began with a farmer's son from Rete, who preferred sandals to silk. Vespasian's legacy was not perfect. He had crushed rebellions with brutal force. He had used heavy taxation. It centralized authority in ways that made future tyranny possible. But he also stabilized a system that had been on the verge of collapse. He chose succession over surprise. He rebuilt confidence where there had been panic. In the annals of Roman emperors, few ruled with such clarity of purpose. His name may not sparkle like Augustus or inspire fear like Trajan, but it endures as one of the rare examples of a man who inherited chaos and left behind calm. That calm would not last forever. Rome would face new crises, new emperors, new enemies. But for a time in the decades after Nero's fall, one man made the empire breathe again. And in doing so, he gave Rome something more valuable than glory. He gave it a second wind. Vespasian's impact extended far beyond infrastructure and governance. Perhaps one of his most overlooked contributions was the psychological repair he initiated in a Rome that had been traumatized by civil war and the narcissistic tyranny of Nero. He didn't promise grandeur, he promised stability. And he delivered that through consistency. Where Nero had performed for applause, Vespasian showed up to work. The difference was not flashy, but it was felt across every rank of Roman society. The people could predict their future again, and that kind of certainty was worth more than gold to a society that had known only chaos for years. This quiet revolution in tone and purpose reshaped how the emperor related to the governed. Vespasian didn't believe in divine right. He didn't pretend to be a god. He was human, fallible, and often comically blunt about his limitations. He joked about money, he dismissed flattery. When told that a statue is being built in his honor, he famously quipped, "Pay it from my own funds and make it taller." That self-awareness made him approachable in legend, if not in person. It created a prototype for leadership that focused on doing rather than dazzling. His reign was less a spectacle and more a steady drumbeat of functionality. But to fully understand Vespasian's influence, one must look at how he governed the army. He had risen through military ranks himself and knew the importance of discipline, loyalty, and fair compensation. After the Civil War, legions across the empire were restless. Their loyalties had been split. Some had fought for Vitellius, others for Otho, and others still had simply waited to see who would win. Vespasian could have purged them. Instead, he restructured command, offered pardons, and redirected their energy into construction and border expansion. He gave them purpose again, and in doing so, he turned potential mutiny into productive might. Soldiers under Vespasian were tasked with rebuilding cities, paving roads, and protecting trade routes. They became not just instruments of war, but agents of renewal. This blending of military strength and civic function strengthened the empire's core. It also made the army see themselves as part of something bigger than conquest. They were builders of Rome itself. That sense of pride filtered down to every outpost. When soldiers believed they were restoring the empire, rather than just defending it, morale improved. Mutiny became rare. Vespasian, ever the strategist, had not only secured peace but loyalty through meaningful labor. In the realm of economics, Vespasian was a fiscal realist. He didn't care about appearances, he cared about income. Nero had drained the treasury with his extravagance. Vespasian filled it back up with taxes, fines, and even creative new revenue streams. Infamous urine tax is still cited as an example of his pragmatism. Public urinals collected waste that was then used in tanning and laundering industries. Vespasian taxed this resource and, when criticized, held up a coin and said, "Pecunia non olet." Money doesn't stink. It was a philosophy that ran through every aspect of his rule. If it worked, it stayed. That attitude also applied to provincial management. Instead of treating the provinces as bottomless wells to extract from, Vespasian saw them as partners in empire. He appointed governors not for their nobility, but their competence. He rewarded good administration and punished exploitation. Local elites were given paths to Roman citizenship, allowing them to feel invested in the empire rather than oppressed by it. This fostered a sense of unity that had been eroded during the Civil War. The provinces became part of Rome's strength again, not just its burden. And this integration would be one of the reasons the empire held together so long after his death. Meanwhile, The Roman Senate, often sidelined or manipulated by emperors, was treated with a blend of respect and control under Vespasian. He didn't gut it, nor did he fully restore its ancient power. Instead, he allowed it to function where useful and ignored it where necessary. He understood that power did not always have to shout to be heard. By allowing the Senate its dignity, even symbolically, he avoided unnecessary conflict and gave the illusion of republican continuity. This was not deception. It was strategic harmony. The Senate, weary of execution and fear, responded by supporting him. It was a truce, not a partnership, but it held. Culture, too, flourished in this climate. Vespasian funded schools, libraries, and temples, not to glorify himself, but to stabilize Roman identity. After years of self-indulgent art meant to flatter the ruler, art began to speak to the people again. Poets like Martial found their voice under Flavian rule, using satire and wit to capture Roman life with honesty. Theaters reopened, forums buzzed with public debate, and architecture served both form and function. It was as though the empire exhaled after holding its breath. Vespasian had not just restored order, he had restored voice and space for civic expression. His relationship with religion was similarly grounded. He respected Roman traditions but did not inflate his own divinity. Temples were built, rites were observed, and the gods were honored, but Vespasian never styled himself as one. Even in death, his final words reportedly mocked the idea. "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god." That was not irreverence. It was clarity. He understood the absurdity of cults of personality. His legacy didn't require him to be worshipped. It required him to be remembered as a builder, a stabilizer, a man who showed Rome how to recover its balance without theatrics. Toward the end of his reign, as illness began to wear on him, Vespasian refused to retreat into the shadows. He kept attending meetings, signing orders, and making decisions. He believed the emperor should be seen, working until the very end. When he finally died in 79 AD, it was not with a spectacle, but with that same sense of unshakable duty. His sons were ready. The empire was stable. The treasury was full. The people were fed. Most importantly, Rome no longer feared itself. He had returned it to sanity. The man who began life in a modest farmhouse had ended it in a marble palace, but he never forgot where he came from. His tomb was simple, his memory lasting. He had not been perfect, but in an age where perfection often came with tyranny, his imperfections had been a blessing. His humor, his grit, his clear-sighted realism, these were the tools he used to rebuild an empire. And while emperors after him would burn brighter, few would burn steadier. The world remembered him not as a hero or villain, but as a craftsman of empire. The transition from Vespasian's reign to his son Titus marked the first time in Roman history that power passed smoothly from father to son within the Principate, solidifying the idea of dynastic succession. This moment wasn't just important politically, it represented the fulfillment of one of Vespasian's greatest achievements, building a legacy that would outlast him. He didn't just rule well, he prepared Rome to function without him. That alone placed him in a different class of emperor from those who ruled as if Rome began and ended with their own lives. Vespasian understood continuity. He didn't crave immortality through monuments. He pursued it through stability. Yet that legacy wasn't automatic. It had to be cultivated. Throughout his rule, Vespasian had quietly positioned his sons in places of influences with military and administrative power, Domitian with public visibility. He didn't simply hand them titles. He gave them opportunities to earn credibility. Titus was sent to suppress the Jewish revolt, and when Jerusalem fell, he returned not just as a conqueror, but as a successor in the public eye. Vespasian made sure the people saw his son not as a prince, but as a leader that mattered more than any law. Roman politics was built on perception. Vespasian mastered it without deception. While the Colosseum is often seen as Titus's project, its foundations were laid by Vespasian, literally and symbolically. He chose the location not just for practical space, but for political theater. The site had once held Nero's artificial lake, a symbol of the emperor's extravagance and detachment from the people. Draining that lake and replacing it with a stadium open to the public was more than construction. It was narrative demolition. Vespasian was tearing down Nero's legacy stone by stone. In its place, he was building something that belonged to the people. Bread and circuses, yes, but also redemption and inclusion. The Flavian Amphitheater, as it was originally called, wasn't just entertainment. It was social architecture. It allowed Rome's diverse classes to gather under one space, reinforcing the illusion, if not the reality, of equality. Vespasian understood the value of spectacle, not as a distraction, but as a release valve. After civil war, the people needed unity. Games offered that. And the lions roared. No one asked who you voted for. That was calculated peace, engineered with stone and blood, and it worked. Rome grew quieter, less fearful, more confident in its place under the empire's vast sky. Vespasian didn't rule alone. His inner circle played crucial roles, and he had the wisdom to appoint capable people without paranoia. He didn't execute half his cabinet out of insecurity. He didn't drown himself in conspiracy. Instead, he surrounded himself with administrators, generals, scholars, and advisors who did their jobs. That simple act, trusting others to work, was revolutionary in a post-Nero empire. Vespasian understood delegation not as weakness, but as structure. It allowed the empire to function even when he wasn't present. Rome became more than the emperor again. It became a system. Culturally, Vespasian's reign encouraged a return to practicality and Roman values. Literature moved from excess to insight. Philosophy found space to ask questions again. Even satire, which had been dangerous under Nero, began to bloom. Writers like Juvenal would rise in the next generation, shaped by the freedom that Vespasian had restored. This wasn't censorship lifted by decree. It was atmosphere changed by tone. When the emperor stopped demanding praise, writers stopped fearing honesty. In that vacuum of fear, creativity returned. And with it, the Roman voice, sharp, humorous, reflective, rose again from the ashes. Economically, Vespasian's policies had ripple effects that extended well beyond his death. By taxing wisely and cutting back waste, he didn't just balance the books, he reshaped how emperors thought about money. He proved that you didn't need to bleed the provinces dry to stay solvent. You needed discipline and vision. Later emperors would forget this. But for a time, Rome's economy was not just surviving, it was growing. Trade routes were secured, markets expanded, grain moved smoothly, roads held firm. Behind the marble and triumphs was a simple truth. Vespasian made things work again. That functionality also extended to law. Vespasian reinforced legal structures without rewriting them to glorify himself. He let Roman law function as intended. Magistrates, praetors, and provincial judges were empowered to rule, not just defer. This made the average Roman feel protected again. Justice didn't mean favor, it meant fairness. That principle, though never perfectly applied, was more present under Vespasian than it had been in decades. And when law feels fair, society settles. That was his genius. He didn't aim to amaze, he aimed to restore. And in doing so, he amazed in silence. Foreign policy during his reign remained cautious, but firm. He didn't launch massive conquests. Instead, he secured what Rome already held, sent legions where they were needed, and avoided wars that would drain the treasury. In Britain, campaigns continued but were methodical. In the East, he maintained stability through diplomacy and displays of force. It wasn't heroic, it was strategic. And that's what Rome needed after so much bloodshed. The empire was big enough. Vespasian wanted to hold it, not stretch it until it snapped. That patience was his strength. Religiously, Vespasian honored the gods without obsessing over them. He restored temples, funded festivals, and allowed regional beliefs to coexist under the imperial umbrella. He didn't enforce religious conformity. That tolerance helped calm tensions across the provinces. In Judea, while the war had been brutal, Vespasian allowed reconstruction and local autonomy afterward. It wasn't kindness, it was calculation. Peace was more profitable than rebellion. He had no interest in erasing cultures. He wanted them orderly, not identical. That model allowed Rome's diversity to become its strength rather than its weakness. Vespasian's personal image was crafted with care. Statues showed him stern, lined, realistic, not idealized. Coins bore his face without excessive flourish. He didn't want to be remembered as a god. He wanted to be remembered as a man who repaired a broken empire. That humility, rare in a ruler, made his legacy durable. It made him human. and in being human, he became relatable to generations that followed. He didn't dazzle like Augustus or terrify like Caligula. He endured, he fixed, led without theatrics. And that, over time, became more memorable than gold-leafed portraits. By the end of his reign, Rome had changed, breathed differently. The scars of the Civil War had begun to fade. The machinery of empire, once jammed and rusted, turned again. And behind that motion was Vespasian, not shouting, not posing, just guiding. His reign proved that the greatest power lies not in conquering new lands or building golden statues, but in making things function, in turning chaos into clarity. He didn't transform Rome with drama. He healed it with discipline. And in that healing, he became the kind of leader every empire needs, but rarely gets. The later years of Vespasian's reign were not marked by decline, but by consistency. That alone was a victory in Rome's unpredictable world. Unlike so many emperors who faltered in their twilight years, clinging to power while the empire rotted beneath them, Vespasian remained focused, continued to govern with pragmatism, steering the empire with steady hands, even as his health declined. He didn't indulge in vanity projects. He didn't sink into paranoia. He didn't try to rewrite his story. He simply worked, day after day, as if Rome itself depended on his discipline. And in many ways it did. Vespasian also understood succession better than most. Where Augustus had hesitated and Tiberius had brooded, Vespasian acted. He made it clear that Titus would follow him. There was no elaborate scheme, no secret heir, no sudden twist. The empire, long tortured by uncertain futures, finally had a smooth path ahead. Vespasian ensured it with laws, with appearances, and with deliberate public gestures. He shared power with Titus before his death, conditioning Rome to accept a new princeps, not with surprise, but with familiarity. That transition set a precedent. It didn't always hold, but it became the model. One of Vespasian's most notable traits was his wit. His humor was dry, biting, and often self-deprecating, a rare quality among emperors. When criticized for taxing public urinals, he reportedly held a coin to his nose and asked whether it smelled. It didn't. Money doesn't stink, he said. That phrase lived on for centuries. And in his final days, when he felt death approaching, he quipped, "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god." Even in death, he mocked the imperial cult. This wasn't just cleverness. It was perspective. He never believed the myth of divinity. He knew what power really was, temporary and heavy. Vespasian's relationship with the Senate remained professional rather than warm. He respected its role, but never relied on its loyalty. He used it as a tool, not a threat. Unlike Caligula or Nero, he didn't provoke it for entertainment. Unlike Claudius, he didn't lean on it for legitimacy. Knew the Senate could serve Rome best when left alone to function. He restored its dignity by not degrading it. And though some senators resented his rise from humble origins, they couldn't argue with the results. Vespasian delivered peace, order, and prosperity. That bought more respect than lineage ever could. The provinces under Vespasian enjoyed more autonomy and attention than they had in years. He appointed capable governors, reformed corrupt structures, and ensured that taxes collected reached Rome instead of lining pockets. His policies encouraged growth in Egypt, stability in Gaul, and improved infrastructure across Asia Minor. Even in North Africa, roads and forts appeared with new vigor. The empire was no longer just surviving outside of Italy, it was thriving. Vespasian treated the provinces not as conquered burdens, but as integral limbs of the Roman body. That mindset would influence imperial policy long after his death. Vespasian also engaged in urban development beyond the Colosseum. He restored temples, repaired aqueducts, and revived neglected districts. He invested in Rome itself, not to glorify his image, but to make the city function. He believed that an emperor's legacy was not in marble, but in livability. Clean water, passable roads, working sewers, these mattered more than golden ceilings. His Rome was not a stage, it was a system. And for the first time in years, the system worked. Citizens noticed, visitors noticed. Even Rome's critics had to acknowledge the change. Vespasian had turned the capital into a functioning heart again. His military remained active but not reckless. Campaigns in Britain and Germany were methodical. Legionaries received better pay, equipment, and discipline. Mutinies ceased. Loyalty returned. Vespasian himself rarely took the field, but his generals followed his model: calm, competent, and relentless. His reforms created a professional army that could hold the empire's vast borders without constant panic. That stability allowed trade to flourish, cities to grow, and diplomacy to function. Rome didn't need more wars, it needed structure. Vespasian delivered that, not by fear, but by standards. He made the army less about glory and more about duty. Domestically, he curbed inflation and stabilized the currency. He didn't print endless coins to cover deficits. He tightened budgets, reduced luxuries, and built reserves. His financial reforms didn't just help his reign, they gave the next emperor a running start. He understood what many rulers forget, that leaving a strong economy behind is the most unselfish act of leadership. Rome had bled under Nero. Under Vespasian, it finally healed. And that healing wasn't glamorous, it was invisible. But its effects reached every corner of the empire, from the grain markets of Alexandria to the docks of Hispania. Education and the arts didn't suffer under Vespasian. Though not a patron on the scale of Augustus or Hadrian, he funded schools, preserved libraries, and supported writers. He didn't demand flattery in return. That freedom gave rise to a new generation of thinkersmen who would shape the next century's philosophies and politics. Rome's intellectual life, dimmed by terror, sparked back to life. It wasn't a renaissance, it was a reawakening. And it started because Vespasian allowed the light back in. He understood that knowledge, like empire, needed space and time to grow. In private, Vespasian remained frugal and earthy. He didn't build palaces, he didn't host decadent feasts. He lived like a soldier, plain meals, modest clothing, early mornings. That simplicity won him admiration. People saw it as honesty. His court was not filled with sycophants, but with workers. He didn't expect worship, he expected results. And that shaped the tone of his rule. Rome didn't tremble under his eye, it steadied. That steadiness became his greatest gift. He didn't offer dreams, he offered mornings that began without fear. That was more revolutionary than any conquest. By the time his health declined, Vespasian had already shaped his legacy. He didn't scramble for last-minute achievements. He prepared for death the way he prepared for rule, with practicality. When the end came in 79 CE, he died not as a god, not as a tyrant, but as a man who had rebuilt an empire brick by brick. His death didn't shake Rome. That was his triumph. The empire didn't fall into panic. It kept moving. That silent continuity was the loudest praise he could have earned. And in that silence, Vespasian's name endured. When Titus took the throne after Vespasian's death, the transition was so smooth it felt almost uneventful, which in Roman politics was nearly a miracle. There was no civil war, no contested claims, no bloody purges. The reason for that was Vespasian's foresight. It not only named Titus as his heir, he had trained him publicly and gradually, allowing the Roman people and elites alike to become familiar with the future emperor. It was a quiet revolution in succession, and it worked. Where emperors before had met their end in fear, Vespasian died with confidence in what came next. The memory of Vespasian lingered in the public spaces he had restored, in the Colosseum rising brick by brick, in the reformed legions guarding the empire's edge. His impact wasn't the kind that sang songs of glory. It was infrastructure, law, and rhythm. Rome under his rule had returned to habit, to function, to breathing again. The people remembered his common touch, his dry humor, his steady rule. He was not worshipped in golden shrines, but remembered in the streets and aqueducts he had repaired. His greatness wasn't declared, it was experienced. Historians like Suetonius and Tacitus would later reflect on his reign with a tone almost of relief. After the theater of Nero and the chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors, Vespasian represented adult supervision. He was the father figure Rome had lacked for too long. His discipline was not harsh but constant. His priorities were clear. He governed not to dazzle, but to restore. That contrast became his legacy. He didn't claim to be divine. He didn't stage grand spectacles. He simply made the empire work. And after so much noise, that silence became sacred. It's easy to overlook rulers like Vespasian in the shadow of conquerors and tyrants. He did not cross the Rubicon, didn't write philosophical treatises, didn't burn cities or proclaim himself a god. What he did was harder. He took a broken empire and fixed it. He made Rome ordinary again, in the best way. No riots, no assassinations, no burning palaces. That ordinariness was extraordinary. It took courage not to dominate, but to rebuild. His reign was not a golden age, but it was a foundation. And foundations, while invisible, are what hold greatness up. His legacy was not just in Rome. In the provinces, especially in the east, Vespasian was remembered as a stabilizer. In Judea, where his campaign had been brutal, the aftermath was managed with relative efficiency. In Egypt, his rise had meant a new administrative clarity. In Gaul and Hispania, his tax reforms ensured fairness. The empire breathed more evenly under him, didn't lurch from crisis to crisis. And for the merchants, soldiers, farmers, and governors scattered across 3 continents, that consistency was priceless. They didn't need a hero. They needed a calendar that didn't change with every emperor's whim. Vespasian's approach to governance echoed through his successors, especially in how they viewed power. Titus and Domitian, for all their differences, inherited a model of imperial behavior grounded in stability. They saw how Vespasian had used authority not for spectacle, but for continuity. And even centuries later, in the age of emperors like Hadrian and Antoninus Pius, echoes of Vespasian's administrative wisdom could still be found. He had shown that an emperor could be powerful without being feared, respected without being loved, and successful without being worshipped. That balance was rare and valuable. Beyond his governance, Vespasian also reshaped what it meant to rise in Rome. He had no noble birth, no ancient pedigree, no Julian lineage, yet he rose through merit, perseverance, and skill. That ascent challenged Rome's rigid class assumptions. It opened space, however narrow, for the idea that greatness could be earned, not inherited. He didn't flaunt that rise. He lived it quietly, but every act he made as emperor sent a message. Origins did not define destiny. That was a powerful idea in an empire built on hierarchy. His military reforms were perhaps his most long-lasting achievement. By professionalizing the legions, raising standards, and rooting out corruption, he left behind an army capable of holding the empire together for another 100 years. He didn't just equip them with swords, he gave them structure. The loyalty he inspired wasn't born of fear, but of trust. They had seen him on campaign. They knew he understood the field. That bond between emperor and soldier became a model future rulers would try to copy and often fail to earn. The Colosseum, whose construction began under Vespasian, remains the most visible symbol of his reign. It was not just an amphitheater. It was a message. Built on the ruins of Nero's private palace, the Colosseum was a gift to the people, a place of entertainment, of public life, of shared culture. It reclaimed space from a tyrant and gave it back to the city. Even in stone, Vespasian governed. He didn't carve his name into it with arrogance. He let the building speak for itself. 2,000 years later, it still does. In the end, Vespasian's greatness lay in his refusal to be great in the traditional sense. He didn't try to dazzle or dominate, he tried to repair. He walked into a broken empire and didn't scream or scheme. He built, he listened, he planned. And in doing so, he left behind something more powerful than monuments. He left behind function. His name may not be the loudest in the history books, but in the rhythm of empire, in the daily workings of Rome, he is everywhere. Because Vespasian understood what power was really for. Not glory, but duty. As the Colosseum's arches continued to rise, casting their widening shadows over Rome, the city itself became a mirror of Vespasian's legacy. Disciplined, restored, and proudly Roman once more. The amphitheater was not only a monument to Roman engineering, it was a declaration. Tyrant's Lake had become a stage for the people. No longer hidden behind palace walls, Rome's pleasures were now public. The emperor who began this transformation was already gone, but his vision laid the bricks. Titus may have opened it, but every stone whispered the name of the man who set it in motion. That was the genius of Vespasian. He knew how to rule with permanence in mind. His reforms were not loud, but they stuck. He had no patience for Nero's indulgences or the chaos of Galba and Otho. He was not interested in artifice or theater unless it served purpose. His empire would not wobble on egos. It would rest on laws, taxes, roads, and men who knew their duties. He delegated authority not as a weakness, but as a strategy, trusting governors, centurions, and administrators with the tools they needed to govern, not just obey. What many forget is how much Vespasian had to lose. He was not born into invincibility. He rose on the edge of risk, with failure always nearby. That made him cautious, but never timid. His instincts were those of a soldier. Assess, plan, strike, and fortify. He didn't crave battles, he sought their end. But when war was necessary, as in Judea, he waged it decisively, finishing what others began and then moving swiftly into the work of rebuilding. Where other rulers were addicted to expansion, Vespasian wanted endurance. He did not dream of Rome growing endlessly. He dreamed of it surviving. His relationship with the Senate was shrewd rather than warm. He respected the institution's role, even as he made clear who held the reins. He didn't humiliate senators, nor did he flatter them. He kept a firm distance, ensuring loyalty through order, not affection. His imperial court avoided the decadence of his predecessors. Simplicity was a weapon he wielded with precision. Even his death lacked spectacle. On his deathbed, legend has it, he joked, "I think I'm becoming a god." It was not a declaration of vanity, but a wink to the absurdity of emperors pretending to be divine. And yet, in some way he was right. Vespasian did become a kind of god not through temples, but through legacy. The Rome he left behind was better than the Rome he inherited. It is rare in history. His sons would reap the stability he sowed, even as Domitian would eventually turn back toward autocracy. But the Flavian dynasty endured because Vespasian had made it strong at the roots. He didn't build a golden age, he built a strong foundation. And that made all the difference when his descendants faced the storms of politics and ambition. In the provinces, Vespasian was remembered differently depending on where you looked. In Britain, his legions brought control. In Egypt, his arrival meant centralization. In Judea, he was the face of conquest and destruction. The temple was gone, and the scars he left there were deep and lasting. Vespasian, like all emperors, was not a single story. To some, he was the restorer. To others, the destroyer. But even his enemies could not deny his effectiveness. He was not erratic. He was not cruel without reason. And in the bloody ledger of Roman rulers, that restraint earned respect. His fiscal reforms reshaped the treasury. Rome had been bleeding gold from Nero's madness and the civil wars that followed. Vespasian stopped the hemorrhaging. He taxed where necessary, saved where possible, and rebalanced the imperial economy. It was unpopular at times, especially his infamous tax on public urinals, but it worked. His pragmatic phrase, pecunia non olet, money does not stink, captured the essence of his rule. Results over image, effectiveness over flair. He was not building admiration, he was building solvency. That sense of grounded leadership extended even to the way he moved through the city. Vespasian was no stranger to the common people. He kept his habits modest, his presence approachable, did not hide behind silk or gold. His humor was dry, his patience thin, but his intentions clear. For the average Roman citizen, this emperor didn't feel distant. He felt like someone who understood their frustrations, who fixed roads, made the grain shipments arrive, and didn't vanish into mythology. He was present. And presence, in an emperor, is a rare and powerful thing. The soldiers especially remembered him. They'd fought under him, laughed at his jokes, trusted his instincts. He had known what it meant to camp in the mud, to march without food, to stand at the edge of defeat and find a way back. That gave him an authority no throne could grant. He wasn't a politician who played general. He was a general who happened to become emperor. And so the loyalty he inspired in the legions was not theatrical. It was real. They didn't just serve him. They followed him. In the final years of his life, Vespasian saw the empire settle. The fires of rebellion cooled. The economy breathed again. Roads and aqueducts resumed their hum. Rome, ever chaotic, found a rhythm. It wasn't perfect. Corruption still lurked. Ambition still stirred. But the house was no longer on fire. It had walls again, a roof, doors that closed. That was his gift, not glory, not conquest, just stability. No, and in the grand sweep of Roman history, that might be the rarest achievement of all. As the twilight of Vespasian's reign crept closer, the empire stood not as a monument to his ego, but as a reflection of his careful, relentless will. Had not reshaped Rome with marble and gold, but with brick, sweat, and taxes. His work lacked the awe of Augustus or the excess of Nero, yet it endured in the bones of the city. In the flow of grain to the poor, in the silent efficiency of repaired roads and disciplined legions. This was not an emperor obsessed with image. He was a builder, a restorer, a soldier who had seen the edge of collapse and quietly pulled Rome back from it. In private, Vespasian aged with the sharpness of a man who never romanticized power. He didn't delude himself into thinking his work would go unchallenged. He knew history was ruthless, and emperors could become footnotes as quickly as they rose to prominence. But he also knew the power of structure, of precedent, of habits enforced across 1,000 cities and 1,000,000 citizens. So he didn't chase immortality through monuments. He chased it through stability, setting foundations that could hold even when he was dust. The succession plan was clear. Titus, his eldest son, had proven himself in war and administration. There would be no scramble for power, no parade of claimants plunging Rome into another civil war. Vespasian, practical to the end, ensured that his dynasty would begin with order, not blood. And while dynastic succession always brought its own risks, it was a risk he considered necessary. The Flavian line would hold for now. It would be tested, reshaped, and eventually extinguished. But the torch would pass smoothly, and that alone was a triumph. Rome itself had changed since he first took the purple. The chaos of the year of the 4 emperors felt distant, almost unreal. The smell of civil war had been washed away by time and order. In its place was a city rediscovering rhythm. The Senate debated, the temples stood firm, markets bustled with foreign goods and local harvests. The empire breathed more easily now, even if it never stopped watching the horizon, because peace in Rome never meant peace forever. But for the moment, the heart of the empire beat strong and steady, and yet, in Judea, the embers still glowed. The destruction of the Second Temple left a wound that could not be healed by taxes or aqueducts. Titus had crushed the revolt, but the memory of it lingered. Vespasian's legacy there was not of restoration, but of fire. It was a reminder that every emperor was both creator and destroyer, that order in one province might come at the cost of devastation in another. He understood this balance, accepted its burden, and never pretended the empire's peace was without price. Even in death, Vespasian defied the norms of imperial ego. There was no obsession with deification, no grand performance of passing into divinity. His final moments were marked not by prophecy, but by wit. That supposed final joke, "I think I'm becoming a god," was not just clever. It was a critique. A reminder that he had always seen through the pomp, even as he wore its robes. It was Rome that needed its emperors to become gods. Vespasian knew he was merely a man. And what work it was. The Colosseum would soon echo with the roars of beasts and the cheers of blood-hungry crowds. Provinces once on the brink now turned prophets. Treasury no longer bled. The legions respected their emperor, not because he dazzled them, but because he led them. His reign had no golden chariot, no divine birthright, no mythical origins. It had a beginning in sweat, a middle in strategy, and an end in quiet triumph. His legacy, like the stones he placed, was meant to last. The Roman people, ever fickle, remembered him not with tears, but with a nod. They knew what came before him: chaos, greed, fire. They knew what followed: order, modesty, rebuilding. Vespasian did not need statues to be remembered. He had given Rome something better: time. It's time to recover, to breathe, to think about what it could be again. That was his monument. The calm after the storm. In the years that followed, Titus would take his father's place, guided by example and memory. Domitian would come after, darker and more autocratic. But even through those shifts, the backbone of the Flavian dynasty remained strong because of how it had begun. Not with dreams or visions or omens, but with a general who saw the mess Rome had become and decided it could be cleaned up. Vespasian's final gift was not glory, but momentum. He handed Rome not a crown of gold, but a map, a ledger, and a broom. He asked the city to keep walking forward, even without him. And for a while, it did. The empire he left behind was not perfect, but it was whole. And in Roman history, that was no small thing. In the years following Vespasian's death, Rome stood taller than it had in decades. The city, once crumbling under Nero's excess and the violence of civil war, thrived with a sense of momentum that could be felt from the markets of the Forum to the frontier forts on the Rhine. His legacy was not merely the buildings or the coins bearing his image. It was the sense that Rome could survive not because of divine favor or aristocratic lineage, because someone had been willing to roll up his sleeves and restore it from the ground up. That someone had come from nowhere. Someone had been him. The Colosseum, still unfinished when he died, was the physical embodiment of his rule. Practical, massive, built for the people. It stood as an arena where plebeians and patricians alike could watch power on display. Blood soaked its sand, and cheers echoed through its arches. But behind the spectacle was a statement. This was a new Rome, one that did not collapse under its own weight. The Flavian Amphitheater, as it was originally named, was both a gift and a message. The emperor cared about his people, or at the very least, he knew they needed bread and shows. Beyond the city, in the provinces, Vespasian's reforms began to bear fruit. Roads functioned again, shipping lanes were protected, and local elites were increasingly brought into the Roman fold. Governors were more closely watched, and exploitation, though never eliminated, was curbed to a degree. The empire, for the first time in years, felt like it was being steered, not just drifting. Soldiers were paid on time, grain flowed in, trade boomed. It wasn't golden, but it was stable. And stability in Rome was often more valuable than glory. Vespasian had understood the limits of power. He knew that emperors were men, not gods. That a throne could become a grave in an instant. So he governed with a careful, often understated touch. His humility wasn't weakness, it was armor. It protected him from the traps that had devoured so many before him: vanity, delusion, isolation. He surrounded himself with competent men. He tolerated criticism, didn't murder his rivals for sport or bankrupt the treasury to buy favor. In many ways, he was the anti-Nero, the antidote to chaos. His death did not shatter the empire, did not plunge Rome into another year of swords and whispers. That was perhaps his greatest achievement. He made the transition of power seem normal, routine, as if the empire could actually function without divine intervention or ruthless purges. Titus stepped into the role seamlessly, and for a brief time, Rome experienced a true dynastic continuation. That moment of calm, brief as it was, testified to the foundations Vespasian had laid. History has often overlooked him, placing more weight on emperors like Augustus, Hadrian, or even Trajan. Vespasian was something rarer, a restorer, a stabilizer. A man who came after disaster and left behind direction. He didn't conquer new lands or pen philosophical treatises. He built, he taxed, he laughed. And he ruled with the quiet, firm hand of a man who never needed to pretend he was more than he was. Even in death, his personality echoed. The story of his final joke, "I think I'm becoming a god," was more than humor. It was a message to every emperor after him. Don't take yourself too seriously. Rome is bigger than you. The empire is not a mirror for your ego. It is a weight to carry. And if you carry it well, that will be enough. That humility is perhaps why the people loved him, why the army followed him, why his reign, though not the most glamorous, became one of the most essential. And as the centuries passed and new emperors claimed divine heritage or brutalized their enemies, the memory of Vespasian endured not in myths, but in results. When others crumbled, he built. When others lied, he joked. When others ruled for self, he ruled for function. His empire worked, and in Rome, that was a rare and precious thing. Vespasian proved that greatness didn't require spectacle. Sometimes, it just required showing up, doing the job, and leaving things better than you found them. That's what Rome needed most. Not another legend, but a man with dirt under his nails, vision in his mind, and the will to do what had to be done. And for 10 years, that's exactly what he gave them. So when we look back at the emperors of Rome, at the madmen, the gods, the conquerors, and the philosophers, let us not forget the builder, the soldier, the father, the man who made Rome breathe again, not with miracles or myths, but with order, discipline, and a dry, stubborn wit. That was Vespasian. That was his Rome, and it endured because of him. The death of Vespasian did not extinguish the flame he had reignited in the heart of Rome. His legacy burned on in the bricks and mortar of the Colosseum, in the restored dignity of the Senate, and in the clarity of Roman governance he brought after a year of chaos. His son Titus succeeded him smoothly, the first peaceful father-to-son transition in a century. It was a testament to the stability Vespasian had engineered, not by chance but through strategy, patience, and a relentless understanding of Rome's needs. Though he never sought to be adored like a god or feared like a tyrant, the empire he passed down was steadier than the one he inherited. It was an empire with its eyes open again. Under Titus, the Colosseum neared completion. Gladiators fought, the crowd roared, and Roman identity was reborn in marble and spectacle. But fate tested Titus as it had tested his father. A great fire struck Rome, followed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the plague. Through each disaster, the people remembered Vespasian's grit and wished for his unshakable calm. Even in death, his example guided them. His governance had not relied on awe or mysticism, but on pragmatism. He did not rule to dazzle, but to last. Rome stood firmer because of him, and even its gods seemed to respect that. Domitian, Vespasian's younger son, would follow Titus and veer away from his father's balance. Where Vespasian built trust, Domitian demanded fear. He took on divine titles, silenced dissent, and ruled like the emperors of old. But even as paranoia grew in the halls of power, Roman historians look back on Vespasian as a measure of reason. They remembered a man who rebuilt temples not to glorify himself but to restore Rome, a man who taxed with logic, not greed, a man who laughed, who listened, who led not by commanding attention, but by commanding respect. That comparison would haunt the emperors who followed. In provinces across the empire, Vespasian's policies echoed. His land reforms brought a new class of citizens into the Roman fold. His veterans built towns, settled lands, and spread Roman law from Spain to Syria. The ripple effect of his rule lasted decades, not through conquests, but through structure. Vespasian understood that Rome's true strength was not its sword, but its system. Empires fell when rulers obsessed over glory. Vespasian built his legacy on groundwork, one law at a time, one grain shipment at a time, one honest administrator at a time. In doing so, he taught Rome how to breathe again. He never wrote great memoirs, never glorified his campaigns, never gave grand speeches to the masses. Instead, he gave Rome something it hadn't had in years: relief from vanity, from instability, from imperial whim. The people saw themselves in him, a man who rose by merit and endured by competence. They called him the mule driver turned emperor, not to insult, but to celebrate. In that title lived the truth of his rule: practical, patient, unbreakable. While others ruled like marble statues, Vespasian ruled like a man. As Rome moved forward, new challenges emerged. Invasions pressed from the north, rebellions stirred in the east, but the institutions Vespasian reinforced held. Not forever, but long enough to shape generations. His reign was a hinge, swinging Rome from the madness of civil war to the relative calm of dynastic stability. That hinge creaked at times, but it never snapped. And that was because Vespasian knew what Rome needed more than grandeur. It needed grounding. He gave it that by keeping his ambitions rooted in Rome's survival, not in his personal myth. Among the ruins of Roman cities today, inscriptions still bear his name. Simple, firm, direct, just like the man. No florid praise, no exaggerated claims, just titles earned and duties fulfilled. His legacy doesn't shout, it stands. Solid, quiet, undeniable. In a time of spectacle, Vespasian proved that real power whispers, that leadership is less about presence and more about persistence, that emperors are not remembered for what they take, but for what they build. And Vespasian built not just roads or walls, but Rome's second chance. He may not have been the most brilliant speaker, the boldest general, or the most charming statesman, but he was, perhaps, the most necessary man of his time. In a moment when everything seemed ready to collapse, he stepped in not as a hero or a savior, but as a craftsman. Brick by brick, he restored the Republic's skeleton beneath the empire's skin. He didn't change Rome overnight. He reinforced it from the foundations up. And in doing so, He ensured it could weather the storms to come, even if those storms would someday be fatal. Vespasian's reign reminds us that some of history's most important figures are not the ones who seize the spotlight, but those who stabilize the stage. He didn't come to revolutionize Rome, he came to repair it. And in that humble mission, he accomplished something rare in imperial history, a legacy that outlived the roar of triumph and the smoke of war. A legacy that still speaks, not in tales of conquest, but in the quiet strength of rebuilding. Centuries passed. The empire that Vespasian helped stabilize eventually cracked under the weight of its own ambitions. Germanic invasions, political corruption, economic decay chipped away at the foundation. Yet even as emperors came and went, as marble crumbled and legions disbanded, the echoes of Vespasian's rule lingered. In dusty records and scattered ruins, his name remained tied not to excess, but to endurance. In an age of giants who burned brightly and fell quickly, Vespasian endured. He did not blind the world with brilliance, built a road and walked it, and others followed. His greatest monument was not the Colosseum, though its arches still cast shadows over Rome. It was the concept of imperial responsibility. The idea that even an emperor must answer to something, whether duty, reason, or history itself. He showed that you could ascend from the lowest rung of society and still carry the burden of an empire with both humility and steel. And that, perhaps, is why he still matters, because his story offers a different model of greatness. Not dazzling, but dependable. Not mythical, but real. Historians debate who was Rome's greatest emperor. Some say Augustus, for founding the empire. Others say Trajan, for expanding it. But among them, Vespasian holds a unique place. He didn't just lead Rome, he healed it. Didn't leave it with grand visions, he left it with a working government. His victories were not against foreign kings, but against collapse itself. And in that victory we find a lesson, as relevant now as it was then, that leadership isn't about glory, it's about survival. It's about knowing when to fight and when to fix. And yet, even in his final days, Vespasian remained grounded. His last words, reportedly, were laced with irony. "I think I'm becoming a god." A jab at the deification of emperors, a wink at the absurdity of power. In death as in life, he reminded Rome to take its rulers seriously, but not too seriously. He knew that power unchecked becomes parody. And so he died as he lived with wit, with calm, with Rome on his shoulders and a joke on his lips. The world moved on. Byzantium rose. Barbarian kingdoms took the West. Christianity redefined the Roman identity. But in every corner of the empire's ruins, from Hadrian's Wall to the sands of the Middle East, the infrastructure of Vespasian's era endured. Aqueducts still flowed, roads still stretched, stones still bore his mark. It's not because he demanded worship, but because he understood function. He was not a legend carved by poets. He was an engineer of order, a governor of chaos. In modern times, few outside of scholars speak his name. He is overshadowed by the emperors who conquered or scandalized. But look closely, and you'll see his fingerprints on the DNA of stable governance. On the sober decisions of statesmen who know that flashy policies fall apart without foundations. On every leader who sees government not as spectacle, but as service. That is Vespasian's ghost. It's not haunting, but guiding. And so, in this long march of history, Vespasian stands not at the front, waving a banner, but behind the scenes, hammer in hand. He reminds us that empires are not sustained by charisma alone. They are sustained by discipline, patience, and the quiet courage to clean up what others destroyed. He took a Rome on fire and made it livable again. That is not romantic, but it is remarkable. His reign ended. His dynasty eventually failed. But his method, the Vespasian way, remained. Grounded in pragmatism, focused on results, rooted in the people. He didn't offer dreams, he offered plans. He didn't demand awe, he earned trust. And in the end, that may be the highest form of imperial success. Because while other emperors built statues to themselves, Vespasian built systems that worked. And while their names faded into myth, his principles quietly lived on. In every functioning piece of Roman governance that lasted beyond his death, in every emperor who ruled with restraint, in every citizen who benefited from the order he restored, that is legacy, not what they remember you for, but what they still use when you're gone. And in that sense, Vespasian never left.